In an explosive and deeply emotional interview given just 1 week after Ozzy Osbourne's passing on July 22, 2025, Black Sabbath bassist Geezer Butler has broken his silence about the final chapter of his longtime friend and bandmate's life, revealing shocking details that completely contradict the public narrative surrounding Ozzy's last months. Speaking from his home in Birmingham, the 76-year-old Butler, visibly shaken and speaking publicly for the first time since Ozzy's death, has disclosed intimate conversations, hidden struggles, and profound moments of clarity that paint a picture of Ozzy's final days that will stun even his closest fans and forever change how the world remembers the Prince of Darkness. Butler, who had been Ozzy's closest friend and creative partner for over 57 years, revealed that he spent nearly every day with the ailing frontman during his final weeks, witnessing firsthand a side of Ozzy that the public never saw. People think they knew Ozzy from the interviews, the reality show, the wild stories, Butler said, his voice heavy with emotion. But in those last days, I saw the real John Michael Osbourne, not the character, not the performer, but the man who had been my brother since we were teenagers, dreaming of escaping the factories of Birmingham. What I witnessed will haunt me for the rest of my life, but it will also inspire me, because I saw someone face their mortality with a courage and wisdom that defied everything people thought they knew about him. The most shocking revelation came when Butler described Ozzy's mental state in his final weeks, which was far more lucid and introspective than anyone, including his family, had realized. The Parkinson's had affected his body terribly, but his mind was clearer than it had been in decades, Butler explained. It was like the disease had stripped away all the noise, all the chaos, all the distractions that had clouded his thinking for so long. He would sit there, barely able to move, but speaking with this incredible clarity about life, death, music, and what it all meant. He told me things in those final weeks that I'm still processing, things that completely changed my understanding of who he was and what he'd been carrying all these years. If these opening revelations have already shocked you, hit that like button, because what Butler reveals next about Ozzy's final conversations will absolutely devastate you. According to Butler, one of the most profound changes in Ozzy during his final days was his relationship with spirituality and his past. Ozzy had always been conflicted about religion, about God, about what comes after death. The Prince of Darkness image was partly a rebellion against the strict Catholic upbringing we both had. But in those last weeks, he wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't rebelling. He was seeking answers, and he was finding a kind of peace that I'd never seen in him before. Butler revealed that Ozzy had been secretly reading religious texts, philosophy books, and even scientific papers about consciousness and death, trying to understand what awaited him on the other side. One afternoon, about 2 weeks before he died, Ozzy looked at me and said, "Geezer, I think I've been playing a character for so long that I forgot who I really was underneath it all. But the closer I get to dying, the more I remember." Why? He told me that the wild behavior, the outrageous antics, even some of the addiction, it had all been a way of avoiding dealing with deep pain and fear that went back to his childhood. He said he'd been running from himself for 50 years, but now that he couldn't run anymore, he was finally meeting the person he'd always been inside. Butler's most shocking disclosure involved Ozzy's attitude toward his own death, which was completely different from what his family and the public believed. Everyone thought Ozzy was afraid of dying, that he was fighting it, desperate to hold on. But the truth is, in those final weeks, he had accepted it completely. More than accepted it. He was almost eager for it. Not because he wanted to leave us, but because he felt like he had completed what he came here to do. He kept saying, "Geezer, I've given everything I had to give. The music, the message, the madness. It's all out there now. It belongs to the people who need it." The bassist revealed that Ozzy had been keeping a detailed journal during his final months, something no one in his family knew about. He would write for hours when he could manage to hold a pen. When the shaking got too bad, he would dictate to a voice recorder. He told me he was documenting everything, his thoughts about each album we made, his regrets, his proudest moments, his hopes for what would happen to his music after he was gone. But most importantly, he was writing letters to specific people he felt he needed to speak to one more time. Butler disclosed that among these letters was one addressed to him personally, which Ozzy had given him just days before his death. with instructions not to read it until after the funeral. When I finally opened it, I broke down completely. It was 15 pages of Ozzy thanking me for being his friend, apologizing for every argument we'd had, every time his ego or his addictions had come between us. But the part that destroyed me was when he wrote about how much our friendship had meant to him, how creating music together had been the greatest joy of his life, greater than fame, greater than money, greater than anything else he'd achieved. The letter, according to Butler, also contained Ozzy's thoughts about each member of Black Sabbath and their complex relationships over the decades. He wrote about Tony Iommi with such love and respect, acknowledging that Tony was always the real musical genius behind Sabbath. He admitted that his own insecurity had sometimes made him competitive with Tony, when he should have just been grateful to make music with someone so talented. About Bill Ward, he wrote pages and pages of regret about how the band had handled Bill's struggles with addiction and health issues. He felt like he had failed Bill as a friend when Bill needed support the most. Butler revealed that Ozzy's final weeks were also marked by an intense creative period that surprised everyone around him. Despite being so physically weak, his mind was generating music constantly. He would hum melodies, dictate lyrics, even try to play simple chord progressions on an acoustic guitar when his hands would cooperate. He told me he was receiving songs from somewhere else, that he felt like he was channeling music that needed to exist in the world, even though he wouldn't be here to perform it. 3 days before he died, Ozzy called me over and played me a recording he'd made on his phone. It was just his voice, weak and shaky, singing this incredibly beautiful melody with lyrics about saying goodbye to everyone he loved. I've never heard anything more heartbreaking or more beautiful in my life. He told me he wanted it to be released after his death, that it was his final gift to the fans who had supported him for so long. The most emotionally devastating revelation concerned Ozzy's relationship with his family during his final days. Butler disclosed that while the public saw a loving family supporting their patriarch, privately, Ozzy was carrying enormous guilt about the toll his lifestyle had taken on those he loved most. He would cry when he talked about Sharon, about how she had sacrificed so much of her own life to manage his career and clean up his messes. He felt like he had robbed her of the chance to have a normal marriage, a peaceful life. He kept saying, "She deserved so much better than me, Geezer. She deserved a husband who didn't put her through hell for 40 years. About his children, he was even more devastated. He believed that his addictions and erratic behavior had damaged them in ways that couldn't be repaired. He would talk about specific incidents, times when he was too drunk or high to be present for important moments in their lives, times when his behavior had embarrassed them or made them feel unsafe. He carried this massive weight of parental guilt that was eating him alive. Butler revealed that Ozzy had spent considerable time during his final weeks trying to make amends, not just through words, but through actions. He had been secretly working with lawyers and financial advisors to ensure that his entire estate would be structured to provide for his family in the most beneficial way possible. He had also set up trust funds for his grandchildren's education and created a foundation to help musicians struggling with addiction and mental health issues. He wanted his death to create something positive, something that would help other people avoid the mistakes he'd made. The bassist also disclosed shocking details about Ozzy's relationship with his own legacy and public image during his final days. Ozzy was deeply conflicted about how history would remember him. On one hand, he was proud of the music we created together and the impact it had on people's lives. But on the other hand, he was terrified that he would only be remembered for the crazy stunts, the addiction, the wild behavior. He desperately wanted people to understand that underneath all that chaos was someone who genuinely cared about his fans and who had tried to use his music to help people feel less alone in their struggles. He told me that the bat-biting incident, which defined so much of his public image, was something he regretted every day for the rest of his life, not because of the controversy it caused, but because it overshadowed the message of the music. He said, "People remember me biting a bat's head off, but they forget that we wrote War Pigs to protest war and violence. They remember the shock value, but miss the meaning." Butler revealed that Ozzy had been working on what he called his true autobiography during his final months, a brutally honest account of his life that would correct misconceptions and reveal truths he had never shared publicly. He wanted people to know about the childhood sexual abuse he suffered, about the depression that had haunted him since he was a teenager, about the way fame and success had isolated him from the very people he was trying to connect with through his music. He felt like he owed his fans the complete truth, even if it was painful to reveal. According to Butler, this autobiography contained revelations that would shock even longtime fans. Ozzy wrote about times when he seriously considered suicide, about periods when he felt so disconnected from reality that he wasn't sure who he was anymore. He wrote about the guilt he felt over Randy Rhoads' death and how it had haunted him for 40 years. He wrote about his struggles with his sexual identity, his complicated relationship with masculinity, and how the hyper-aggressive image he projected was often compensation for feeling vulnerable and afraid. The bassist also disclosed that Ozzy's final days were marked by an intense desire to reconnect with his working-class roots and the community that had shaped him. He wanted to spend time in the neighborhoods where we grew up, talking to people who remembered him as John Osbourne before he became Ozzy. He felt like fame had pulled him away from the very people whose struggles had inspired our music in the first place. In his final weeks, he was trying to remember who he had been before the world changed him. Butler revealed that these visits to their old neighborhood had profoundly affected Ozzy's final perspective on his life and career. We went back to the house where he grew up, and he just stood there crying, remembering what it felt like to be a poor kid with big dreams. He talked about how music had been his escape from poverty and violence, but how success had created new kinds of prisons. He said he felt like he'd spent his whole life trying to get back to that feeling of pure love for music that he'd had as a teenager. One of the most shocking revelations concerned Ozzy's relationship with his own mortality and his beliefs about what happens after death. Butler disclosed that in his final weeks, Ozzy had become convinced that consciousness survives physical death and that he would be reunited with deceased friends and family members. He talked constantly about seeing Randy again, about being able to apologize to people he felt he'd wronged who had died before he could make amends. He wasn't afraid of death because he believed it was just a transition to a different state of existence. 3 days before he died, Ozzy told me that he had been visited by his mother, who had passed away years earlier. He said she appeared to him and told him that it was time to come home, that he had done everything he needed to do in this life. I know how that sounds, but Ozzy was completely lucid when he told me this. He wasn't hallucinating or confused. He was calm and peaceful in a way I'd never seen him before. Butler also revealed that Ozzy had specific instructions about his funeral and memorial services that went far beyond what the public witnessed. He wanted his death to be a celebration, not a mourning. He had planned every detail of the public procession through Birmingham because he wanted to give his fans a chance to say goodbye properly. But he also planned a private ceremony that was much more spiritual and introspective, focused on healing and forgiveness rather than fame and celebrity. The bassist disclosed that this private ceremony included rituals and elements that reflected Ozzy's spiritual journey during his final months. He had asked for readings from various religious and philosophical traditions, music that reflected his entire spiritual evolution, and time for everyone present to share their honest feelings about their relationship with him, including their anger and disappointment, as well as their love. He wanted complete honesty, complete authenticity, even in death. Butler's most emotionally charged revelation concerned Ozzy's final words and the circumstances of his death. "I was with him when he died, along with Sharon and the kids. He had been mostly unconscious for the previous day, but about an hour before he passed, he opened his eyes and looked at each of us with complete clarity. He told Sharon he loved her and thanked her for saving his life. He told each of his children how proud he was of them and how sorry he was for not being the father they deserved. Then he looked at me and said, 'Geezer, we did it, didn't we? We made something beautiful together. We helped people feel less alone.' I told him yes, we had done exactly that. He smiled, closed his eyes and said, 'Good, I can go now.' Those were his last words. He died peacefully, surrounded by love, knowing that his life had mattered." Butler revealed that in the hours immediately following Ozzy's death, the family discovered additional letters and recordings he had prepared for specific occasions and people. He had recorded birthday messages for his grandchildren for the next 10 years. He had written letters to be opened on anniversaries, graduations, weddings, all the important moments he wouldn't be physically present for. Even in death, he was trying to be there for the people he loved. The bassist also disclosed that Ozzy had made specific requests about how his musical legacy should be handled. He wanted all the unreleased recordings from our early days to be preserved and eventually made available to fans. He had also been working with archivists to ensure that the complete history of Black Sabbath would be documented accurately, including the difficult periods that we had all preferred to forget. He felt like the complete story needed to be told, not just the highlights. Butler revealed that among Ozzy's final projects was a series of recordings intended specifically for people struggling with addiction and mental health issues. He had recorded hours of material, not music, but spoken reflections about his own struggles and recovery. He wanted these recordings to be made available through treatment centers and support groups, free of charge. He said if his experiences could help even one person avoid the pain he had gone through, it would give meaning to all the suffering he had endured. The bassist's most profound revelation concerned how Ozzy's final weeks had changed his own understanding of life, death, and friendship. Watching Ozzy face his mortality with such grace and wisdom taught me more about courage than 50 years of making music together had. He showed me that it's possible to die with dignity, even if you haven't lived perfectly, that redemption is always possible if you're willing to be completely honest about who you are and what you've done. Butler disclosed that Ozzy's death had inspired him to make his own life changes and to prioritize relationships over career achievements. Seeing how much Ozzy regretted the time he had wasted on ego, on feuds, on protecting his image, made me realize that I needed to focus on what really matters. Life is too short and too precious to spend it on anything other than love, music, and genuine human connection. The bassist concluded his revelations with a message that he said Ozzy had specifically asked him to share with the public. Ozzy wanted everyone to know that despite all his struggles, despite all his mistakes, he considered his life to have been incredibly blessed. He got to make music with his best friends. He got to connect with millions of people around the world, and he got to experience love in its deepest forms. He wanted people to remember that no matter how dark things get, there's always the possibility of redemption, always the possibility of finding meaning and purpose. Most importantly, he wanted young people to know that they don't have to repeat his mistakes to create meaningful art. You don't have to destroy yourself to be authentic. You don't have to choose between being successful and being healthy. The greatest rebellion isn't self-destruction, it's self-acceptance and the courage to be completely honest about who you are. Butler revealed that he is now working on a book that will include more of these conversations and insights from Ozzy's final weeks, with all proceeds going to the Mental Health and Addiction Support Foundation that Ozzy had established. This isn't about making money or extending my own career. This is about honoring my friend's final wishes and ensuring that his real message, not just his music, but his hard-won wisdom about life and recovery, reaches the people who need to hear it. The bassist's final revelation was perhaps the most moving of all. The night before Ozzy died, he told me that he wasn't afraid anymore. He said he had found peace with all his choices, good and bad, because they had led him to the people and experiences that mattered most. He said that if he had to live his life over again, he would try to be kinder to himself and others, but he wouldn't change the essential journey because it had brought him to a place of love and understanding. That's how I want people to remember him, not as the wild man or the recovering addict or even the rock star, but as someone who spent his entire life searching for connection and meaning, and who ultimately found both in the relationships he built and the music he created. Ozzy Osbourne died as he had lived, completely honest, deeply loving, and absolutely authentic. Butler's revelations have already begun to change how fans and critics view Ozzy's legacy, replacing the simplistic narrative of the self-destructive rock star with a more complex and ultimately more inspiring story of redemption, growth, and the power of human connection. As the world continues to process these intimate details about the Prince of Darkness's final days, one thing has become clear. Ozzy Osbourne's greatest performance was not on any stage, but in the way he faced his own mortality with courage, wisdom, and love. If this incredible insight into Ozzy's final days has moved you as much as it has moved us, please show your support by hitting that like button. Geezer Butler's revelations remind us that behind every public persona is a human being capable of growth, redemption, and profound love, and that sometimes the most important truths are revealed not in life's loudest moments, but in its quietest ones. The Prince of Darkness may be gone, But the light he found in his final days continues to illuminate the path toward healing and hope for everyone still struggling to find their way.